Welcome to the quietest corner of the village. We knew you'd find us eventually.
Chapter 1. The best bloom brouhaha. Agatha Raisin stood before the full-length mirror in her cottage bedroom, glaring at her reflection with the kind of intense, simmering hostility usually reserved for slow-moving tractors on country lanes. The enemy today was not a tractor, but the oppressive, damp heat of a Cotswold summer. It had entirely destroyed her expensive Mayfair blow-dry, transforming her usually sleek, manageable bob into something resembling a startled brown dandelion. Maddening, Agatha hissed, attacking the frizz with a hairbrush and a liberal cloud of industrial-strength hairspray. She smoothed down her tailored scarlet linen shift dress. It was a fiercely chic garment, completely unsuited for a village fete, which was exactly why she had chosen it. If she was going to be subjected to an afternoon of dodging wasps, admiring lopsided Victoria sponges, and pretending to care about marrows, she was going to do it looking like a woman who had once commanded a highly successful London PR firm. She grabbed her handbag and marched downstairs to the kitchen, where her true anxiety lay waiting on the granite countertop. It was a magnificent, impossibly flawless cymbidium orchid, boasting cascades of vibrant magenta flowers. Agatha had not grown it. She had purchased it 3 days prior from a terrified florist in Knightsbridge for a sum that could have fed a small family for a month. She had then spent a tense hour in her garden shed, transferring it into a weathered terracotta pot and strategically smearing a little local Carsely mud around the rim to give the illusion of rustic, homegrown toil. She desperately wanted to win the Carsely Horticultural Society's Best in Show rosette. She didn't particularly care about gardening. In fact, she viewed nature as a generally untidy nuisance, but she cared deeply about winning. More importantly, she cared about beating Fiona Henshaw. Fiona was a relatively new addition to the village, having moved in 6 months ago following a lucrative divorce. She was a maddeningly willowy woman in her early 40s who possessed a natural glowing complexion, an irritatingly tinkling laugh, and the ability to wear floral prints without looking like a heavily upholstered armchair. Worst of all, Fiona was naturally green-fingered. Her garden was a riot of perfectly disciplined blooms, and she had spent the last 3 weeks dropping loudly modest hints at the village shop about her heritage roses. Agatha picked up the heavy terracotta pot, her jaw set in a determined line. "Let's see the smug cow beat this," she muttered. The village hall was a sweltering canvas of competitive malice disguised as neighbourly cheer. Bunting sagged in the humid air, and the scent of damp earth mingled nauseatingly with the smell of cheap tea and overheated pensioners. Agatha carried her orchid into the main exhibition tent, her scarlet dress cutting a swath through a sea of beige cardigans and sensible shoes. She slammed the pot down on the display table marked Exotic Flora just as Mrs. Bloxby, the vicar's wife, drifted over. "Oh, Agatha," Mrs. Bloxby said softly, her kind eyes resting on the immaculate orchid. "What a spectacular specimen. It looks almost too perfect to be real." "Lots of talking to it," Agatha lied smoothly, adjusting a leaf. "And classical music. Mozart, mostly." "Fascinating," came a high, breathy voice from behind her. Agatha stiffened. She turned to find Fiona Henshaw smiling at her. Fiona was wearing a flowing lavender sundress that made Agatha feel suddenly overheated and over-tailored. "Agatha, darling," Fiona said, her gaze sweeping over the magenta blooms. "How incredibly brave of you to attempt an orchid in this climate. Though I do wonder if the judges might prefer things actually grown in Gloucestershire, rather than, well, wherever this poor, forced darling originated." Agatha felt a familiar hot prickle of rage climb up her neck. "It was grown right here in my conservatory, Fiona," she said, her voice tight enough to snap. Fiona let out that tinkling laugh. "Of course it was, dear. It's lovely, truly. Almost as lovely as plastic." She patted Agatha's arm, a deeply patronizing gesture that made Agatha briefly calculate the legal repercussions of shoving Fiona headfirst into the nearby display of giant cabbages. "I must dash. Sir Reginald is about to judge the heritage roses, and one must be present to answer his little questions." Fiona glided away, leaving Agatha seething. "Don't let her ruffle you, Agatha," Mrs. Bloxby murmured gently. "I am not ruffled," Agatha snapped, furiously wiping a bead of sweat from her upper lip. "I am perfectly calm. I just find her utterly insufferable. If she smiles at me like that one more time, I won't be responsible for my actions." An hour passed. The heat in the tent became unbearable. The head judge, Sir Reginald, a pompous local aristocrat with a red face and a booming voice, had thoroughly inspected the jams, prodded the parsnips, and was now standing by the central podium, holding the massive crimson rosette for Best in Show. the tent fell into an expectant, buzzing hush. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sir Reginald boomed, tapping a microphone that let out a painful squeal. "Magnificent showing this year. Truly. But there can be only one overall champion. And this year, I am delighted to award the best in show to, Mrs. Fiona Henshaw for her truly breathtaking Rosamundi." Polite applause rippled through the tent, masking Agatha's loud, disgusted snort. "Fiona." Sir Reginald peered over his half-moon spectacles. "Fiona, my dear, do come up." The applause continued, then sputtered out. People began looking around. The lavender sundress was nowhere to be seen. Probably adjusting her makeup to ensure she looks appropriately surprised, Agatha muttered to the village postman, who looked at her in alarm and edged away. "Perhaps she stepped out for some air," Mrs. Bloxby suggested. 5 minutes passed. The murmurs in the tent grew louder, shifting from polite confusion to genuine irritation. Sir Reginald was looking distinctly put out. Agatha, whose feet were throbbing in her stylish heels and who desperately wanted a gin and tonic, lost her patience. "For heaven's sake," she announced loudly. "I'll go and find the woman. She's probably holding court by the tea urn." She pushed her way out of the stifling marquee and into the relatively cooler air of the vicarage gardens. She checked the tea tent, empty save for a few wasps. She checked the portaloos, wrinkled her nose, and kept walking toward the back of the village hall, where the competitors' preparation sheds were located. "Fiona," Agatha barked, marching down the gravel path. "Stop playing the blushing violet and get out here. Your ridiculous prize is waiting." She rounded the corner of the largest wooden shed. "Fiona, I swear if you are Agatha stopped dead." The heavy, suffocating heat of the afternoon seemed to suddenly vanish, replaced by a cold, sharp shock that anchored her to the gravel. Fiona Henshaw was not adjusting her makeup. She was lying flat on her back among a scattered pile of empty terracotta pots and ripped bags of potting soil. Her beautiful lavender dress was stained dark with dirt. Agatha took a slow, hesitant step forward, her heart beginning a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. "Fiona?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Tightly wound around Fiona's slender neck, cutting deep into the pale skin, was a length of premium rubber-coated green gardening wire. Her eyes were wide open, staring sightlessly up at the hazy summer sky. Agatha stood frozen for 3 long seconds. In that strange, suspended moment of pure shock, her hyper-observant mind registered 2 distinct things. First, that someone had murdered the most popular woman in Carsely. And second, looking closely at Fiona's face in the harsh daylight, Agatha realized with a faint jolt of vindication that Fiona's glowing complexion was, in fact, the result of some very expensive, expertly applied foundation. Agatha drew a deep breath, clutching her designer handbag to her chest, and let out a piercing, glass-shattering scream that echoed across the vicarage lawn, officially bringing the Carsely annual flower show to a devastating end. Chapter 2. The Marquee of Malice. The screech of police sirens shattered the bucolic peace of Carsely, a noise Agatha usually associated with the Euston Road, not the vicarage gardens. Within 20 minutes, the previously idyllic flower show had been transformed into a chaotic crime scene, cordoned off by aggressively bright blue and white tape that clashed hideously with the remaining bunting. Agatha sat on a remarkably uncomfortable folding wooden chair inside the main marquee, glaring at a lukewarm cup of tea in a polystyrene cup. Her feet were throbbing in her scarlet heels, and the humidity in the tent had reached a level she considered personally vindictive. Worse than the heat, however, was the indignity of being treated like a suspect by Detective Inspector Wilkes. Wilkes was a man whose primary detecting skill seemed to consist of sweating profusely and looking exasperated. He stood before Agatha, a notepad in his meaty hand, attempting to stare her down. It was a foolish endeavour. Agatha had regularly stared down hostile corporate boards in London. A sweaty Cotswold policeman was amateur hour. "So, Mrs. Raisin," Wilkes said, his voice laced with the heavy, patronising tone of a man who firmly believed women over 50 should be invisible. "Let me get this straight." You just happened to wander behind the sheds. During the most important announcement of the day, "I did not wander," Inspector Agatha snapped, sitting rigidly straight to prevent the scarlet linen from creasing further. "I marched. There is a distinct difference." Fiona had vanished just as she was meant to collect her absurd rosette. As the rest of the village was standing about gaping like landed trout, I took the initiative to find her. Sergeant Bill Wong, a young, round-faced policeman who was one of Agatha's few genuine friends in the local constabulary, hovered behind Wilkes. He shot Agatha a sympathetic, warning look. "Play nicely," his dark eyes seemed to plead. Agatha ignored him, If you are implying, Inspector, that I strangled the woman with gardening wire because she beat my orchid, I suggest you look closely at my manicure. Do you honestly think I would risk an £80 French polish to wrestle with a woman half my age in the dirt? Wilkes' face flushed a deep, mottled purple. I am merely establishing a timeline, Mrs. Raisin. It is no secret that you and the deceased did not exactly see eye to eye. Nobody saw eye to eye with Fiona, Agatha corrected bluntly. They mostly just looked at her chest or her checkbook, depending on their gender. Now, if you are quite finished stating the obvious, I should like to go home and remove these shoes before my toes fuse together. Wilkes grunted, snapped his notebook shut, and dismissed her with a wave of his hand. Don't leave the village, Mrs. Raisin. I live here, you idiot, she muttered under her breath as she stood up, brushing invisible dust from her skirt. Released from the immediate custody of the police, Agatha refused to go home. Instead, she drifted toward the tea urn, where the remaining villagers had been corralled to await questioning. The atmosphere in the tent was electric. Nothing energized a sleepy Cotswold village quite like a gruesome murder, provided it happened to someone who had only lived there for 6 months. Agatha accepted a fresh, slightly better cup of tea from Mrs. Bloxby. The vicar's wife looked pale and distressed, a stark contrast to the buzzing excitement animating the rest of the room. Terrible, Agatha. Just terrible, Mrs. Bloxby murmured, her hands trembling slightly as she held the teapot. Who could do such a wicked thing? Half the village from the sound of it, Agatha replied in a low voice, her sharp eyes scanning the clusters of gossiping neighbours. The grief on display was remarkably thin. Instead, a frenzied, hushed speculation had taken over. Agatha sidled closer to a group comprising Miss Simpson, the village spinster who treated gossip as an Olympic sport, and Colonel Danvers, a retired military man with a bristling mustache and a perpetually red nose. I am telling you it was financial, Miss Simpson hissed, leaning in so closely her floral hat nearly tipped off. I saw her arguing with a man in a very flashy sports car last Tuesday. Suited chap. Looked like a debt collector. Or a pimp. Nonsense, woman, Colonel Danvers barked, though he looked secretly thrilled. Fiona had money pouring out of her ears. Alimony, she told me. No, mark my words, it's a crime of passion. She was a very friendly woman, if you catch my drift. Agatha's ears pricked up. Friendly. It was village code for promiscuous. She scanned the room and her gaze landed on John Lillington, the usually robust and booming chairman of the parish council. He was standing alone by the collapsed Victoria sponges, looking as though he might be sick into a nearby display of hydrangeas. His hands were stuffed deep into the pockets of his tweed trousers, and his eyes kept darting nervously toward the flap of the marquee, where the police were conducting interviews. Agatha's famous, entirely uninvited detective instincts flared to life. She forgot about her aching feet. She forgot about her ruined hair. She set her teacup down with a sharp clatter and marched straight over to him. You look awful, John, Agatha declared loudly, bypassing any socially acceptable preamble. Lillington jumped, nearly knocking over a jar of award-winning marmalade. Agatha! Good Lord, keep your voice down. It's the shock. Naturally, terrible business. Yes, terribly inconvenient. Agatha agreed, her eyes narrowing as she studied his unusually sweaty brow. Especially since you spent 4 afternoons last week at her cottage, helping her with her mulch, wasn't it? Lillington's ruddy complexion drained to a sickly grey. Tu was advising her on soil acidity. As parish chairman, it's my duty to welcome newcomers. My wife knows all about it. Does she? Agatha asked smoothly, noting the way Lillington's left eye gave a frantic little twitch. How very progressive of Mary, to let you welcome a beautiful divorcee for 4 consecutive afternoons. Listen here, Agatha, Lillington hissed, glancing frantically around the tent. You mind your own damn business. You don't know what you're talking about. He spun on his heel and practically bolted toward the exit, nearly colliding with Sergeant Wong. Agatha watched him flee, a triumphant, cynical little smile playing on her lips. People always told you exactly what they were hiding by trying too hard to hide it. She had promised herself she wouldn't get involved. She had told herself to leave it to the professionals. But as she looked around at the polite, smiling faces masking a hotbed of jealousy, debt, and illicit affairs, Agatha Raisin knew she simply couldn't help herself. The police were going to bungle this. It was entirely up to her. Chapter 3, The Danger of a Sympathy Call the Morning After a Murder, Agatha discovered, was much like the morning after a disastrous PR campaign. One woke up with a dry mouth, a lingering sense of paranoia, and an urgent need for strong black coffee. She sat at her kitchen island, wrapped in a silk dressing gown that had cost more than her first car, and stared bleakly at her iPad. She had opened it with the vague intention of reading the news, but the screen had gone dark, perfectly reflecting her face. Agatha sighed, reaching up to tug at the skin along her jawline. Was it sagging? It was definitely sagging. In London, she would have simply booked a discreet appointment in Harley Street. Here in Carsely, her only defense against the ravages of time was expensive moisturizer and sheer, unyielding stubbornness. A familiar pang of loneliness twisted in her chest. She had retired to the Cotswolds seeking a chocolate box dream of roaring fires and friendly neighbours. Instead, she had found damp, cold, rampant snobbery and a social circle that viewed her with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for a fox in a henhouse. But as she took a sip of her scalding coffee, the memory of Fiona Henshaw lying dead among the potting soil pushed the melancholy away. A spark of genuine, thrilling energy ignited in Agatha's veins. A murder. A real bona fide murder. And the police, led by that sweating buffoon Wilkes, were undoubtedly going to arrest some passing tramp and call it a day. Agatha marched upstairs. If she was going to investigate, she needed armour. Half an hour later, armoured in a crisp navy blazer, impeccable tailored trousers, and a slash of intimidating crimson lipstick, she set out into the village. Her first stop was the village shop, the undisputed epicentre of Carsley's rumour mill. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully, entirely at odds with the grim atmosphere inside. Mrs. Mason, the shopkeeper, was leaning over the counter, deep in hushed conspiratorial conversation with Miss Simpson. They both snapped their mouths shut the moment Agatha walked in. "Morning," Agatha announced, entirely unbothered by the sudden guilty silence. She strode over to the biscuit aisle and selected a tin of wildly overpriced shortbread. Terrible business yesterday, wasn't it? Shocking. Ah. Dreadful, Mrs. Raisin, Mrs. Mason said, her eyes gleaming with morbid excitement. They haven't released the body yet, you know. Post-mortem. Well, she was strangled with gardening wire, Agatha said bluntly, slapping the shortbread onto the counter. Miss Simpson let out a tiny, horrified squeak. Hardly a mystery how she died. The question is who. I noticed John Lillington looking as guilty as a dog caught with a stolen roast before he fled the marquee. Mrs. Mason's lips pursed in a tight, disapproving line. Mr. Lillington is a pillar of the community. He was merely doing his civic duty, helping the poor woman with her boarders. Boarders, Agatha repeated, layering the word with so much sarcasm it practically dripped onto the linoleum. Right, because when I need help with my boarders, I invariably summon a married, sweating 50-year-old man who drives a Volvo. Keep the change, Mrs. Mason. Armed with her shortbread and a burning sense of self-righteousness, Agatha marched straight down the high street to the Lillingtons' immaculate, ivy-clad cottage. She did not have a plan, strictly speaking. She merely possessed a profound lack of boundaries and a desperate need to know what was going on. She banged the brass knocker. A moment later, Mary Lillington opened the door. Mary was a woman who seemingly purchased all her clothes from catalogues that specialized in the word sensible. She wore a beige cardigan over a beige blouse, and her face was tightly composed into a mask of polite hostility. "Agatha," Mary said, blocking the doorway. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I've brought shortbread," Agatha said, thrusting the tin forward. "I thought, given the shock of yesterday, you and John might need some comfort. It's a terrible strain, isn't it? Knowing John was so close to the deceased." Mary did not take the tin. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the edge of the heavy oak door. "I have absolutely no idea what you mean, Agatha. My husband is the parish chairman. He is polite to everyone." "Oh, calm off it, Mary," Agatha huffed, losing her patience entirely. "He practically lived in her garden this past week. Half the village knows it. I'm just trying to help before Inspector Wilkes comes poking around and jumps to the wrong conclusion." Mary's eyes narrowed into hard, flinty slits. For a second, the beige, sensible woman vanished, replaced by someone intensely angry and remarkably cold. "My husband was at home with me all morning yesterday, Mrs. Raisin. We were cleaning the gutters. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a sponge cake in the oven. Take your biscuits and your filthy insinuations elsewhere." The door slammed shut with a definitive crack mere inches from Agatha's nose. Agatha blinked, momentarily taken aback. Well, that was certainly a reaction. Not a tear shed for the poor murdered Fiona, but a fierce, almost violent defensiveness. "Making friends as usual, Agatha." Agatha spun around. Sergeant Bill Wong was leaning against the stone wall at the edge of the Lillingtons' driveway, his arms crossed over his uniform. "I was performing a civic duty, Bill," Agatha said, lifting her chin and adjusting her blazer, offering comfort to the distressed. "Right," Bill sighed, pushing himself off the wall. "And I am the Queen of Sheba. Listen to me, Agatha. Wilkes is already in a foul mood. Do not go kicking over rocks in this village. This isn't a PR stunt. It's a murder investigation." "I am perfectly aware of that," Agatha retorted, her pride stinging. "But if you think I am going to sit at home knitting while a killer wanders about my village, you are very much mistaken." She turned on her heel and marched away, her mind racing faster than her stilettos on the cobblestones. Mary Lillington was hiding something. John Lillington was terrified. And Agatha Raisin, despite every logical reason to mind her own business, was officially on the case. Chapter 4. The convenience of a grumpy gardener. Agatha was still simmering with indignation when she returned to her cottage. Mary Lillington's slammed door had felt like a physical slap to her notoriously fragile pride. She kicked off her heels, poured herself a generous measure of gin, and collapsed onto her plush sofa. Before she could even take a restorative sip, the brass knocker on her front door clattered urgently. Agatha groaned. If it was Mary Lillington coming to apologize, she fully intended to make the woman grovel on the doormat before she even considered opening the door fully. She swung the door open, her expression fixed in a haughty scowl, only to find the gentle, anxious face of Mrs. Bloxby. The vicar's wife was clutching a woven shopping basket, as if it were a life raft in a turbulent sea. "Agatha, dear," Mrs. Bloxby breathed, stepping into the hallway without waiting for an invitation. "Have you heard? The village is absolutely buzzing with it. It's terrible. Just terrible." Agatha felt a familiar electric thrill. "Heard what? Has Lillington confessed?" "John?" "Heavens, no," Mrs. Bloxby said, looking entirely bewildered. "Why on earth would John confess?" "No, it's Arthur. Arthur Pendleton. The police have just taken him away in a squad car. Handcuffs and everything. Poor Mrs. Pendleton was out in the street, weeping into a damp dish towel." Agatha stared. "Arthur Pendleton? The miserable old sod who runs the allotments by the churchyard?" "The very same," Mrs. Bloxby sighed, following Agatha into the kitchen and gratefully accepting a cup of tea. Inspector Wilkes seems terribly pleased with himself. He was practically strutting outside the post office. Apparently Arthur had a most dreadful row with poor Fiona yesterday morning, shouting in the street right outside the baker's. Agatha frowned, taking a large gulp of her gin. "What about—" "Compost," Mrs. Bloxby whispered, as if the word itself were scandalous. Fiona, it seems, had ordered a special delivery of imported nutrient-rich soil. The delivery lorry accidentally crushed a corner of Arthur's prize marrow patch while reversing. Arthur lost his temper, accused her of being a careless, flaunting upstart, and threatened to wring her scrawny neck. Inspector Wilkes found a spool of green gardening wire sitting right on Arthur's potting bench. "Mrs. Bloxby," Agatha said, her voice dripping with profound disbelief, "every single person in Carsely who owns so much as a window box has a spool of green gardening wire. I have 3 in my shed right now. Does Wilkes intend to arrest me next? Well, the inspector feels the public threat, combined with the proximity of the weapon. It's entirely too neat," Agatha snapped, pacing the length of her kitchen. The annoyance she felt was palpable. It wasn't that she liked Arthur Pendleton. The man smelled perpetually of damp cabbage and had once rudely criticized her completely unconvincing attempt at growing organic courgettes, but she hated the idea of Inspector Wilkes solving a murder before she had even properly begun to meddle. More importantly, her instincts, honed by years of sniffing out corporate sabotage, told her it was wrong. "It doesn't make sense," Agatha continued, ticking points off on her manicured fingers. "First of all, Arthur is 72 years old and suffers from crippling arthritis in his hands. He can barely grip a trowel, let alone exert the prolonged, violent force required to strangle a healthy woman in her early 40s. Secondly, Arthur is a vegetable man. He despises flowers. He calls them frivolous weeds. He wouldn't have been anywhere near the floral display tents he would have been guarding his onions. Someone is using him as a convenient scapegoat." Determined to prove Wilkes wrong if only to wipe the smug satisfaction off the inspector's sweaty face, Agatha threw on a trench coat over her tailored trousers and marched out into the fading afternoon light. Her destination was the Red Lion, the village pub, and the undisputed headquarters of Carsely's rumour mill. Pushing open the heavy oak door, Agatha was met with a wall of noise, the smell of stale beer, and the crackle of a roaring fire. The pub was packed. In the centre of the room, holding court with a pint of ale in his hand, was Detective Inspector Wilkes. Agatha bought a gin and tonic from the bar and edged her way through the crowd until she was standing just behind Wilkes, close enough to smell the cheap aftershave radiating from his collar. Open and shut, lads. Wilkes was booming to a captive audience of local farmers. Textbook crime of passion. Well, crime of agricultural rage anyway. We've got the motive, we've got the public threat, and we found the murder weapon right where he left it. Stupid old fool didn't even try to hide the wire. Hey, Inspector, Agatha said loudly, cutting through his triumphant bluster. Wilkes turned, his smile vanishing instantly. Mrs. Raisin, shouldn't you be at home mourning your lost Rosette? A few of the farmers snickered. Agatha's eyes flashed with dangerous fire, but she kept her voice dangerously calm. I'm surprised at you, Inspector, she purred, taking a delicate sip of her drink. I thought a man of your vast experience would be able to spot a frame-up. Wilkes' face reddened. Now listen here, did you happen to check Arthur's hands? Agatha interrupted smoothly. The man's knuckles are swollen to the size of walnuts. I doubt he could open a jar of pickles, let alone strangle a woman who, let's face it, spent 3 days a week at an expensive Pilates studio in Cheltenham. Furthermore, Arthur never touches rubber-coated wire he swears by natural twine for his beans. I heard him say so at the parish meeting. Wilkes glared at her, his jaw working furiously. I do not discuss ongoing investigations with civilians, Mrs. Raisin, especially civilians who have a habit of making a nuisance of themselves. I am not making a nuisance, Agatha replied brightly. I am pointing out a glaring hole in your logic before you embarrass yourself in front of the magistrate. Whoever killed Fiona Henshaw had strong hands, a cool head, and a much better motive than a squashed marrow. She set her empty glass on a nearby table with a sharp click. You've got the wrong man, Inspector. And while you're busy congratulating yourself, the real killer is sitting in this village, laughing at you. Agatha turned and walked out of the pub, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Her heart was pounding, a mixture of adrenaline and absolute terror at her own audacity. No, she had no evidence, no suspect, and no real plan. But she was Agatha Raisin, and she was going to find the truth, even if it killed her. Chapter 5. The folly of a peace offering the morning after her spectacular, entirely uninvited outburst at the Red Lion. Agatha Raisin woke up with a familiar, sinking feeling of social regret. It was one thing to outsmart a sweating buffoon like Inspector Wilkes, it was quite another to do it in front of half the village. In London, public humiliation was practically a PR strategy. In Carsely, it was social suicide. She stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, noting with a pang of despair that the stress was making her look terribly drawn. She applied a liberal layer of impossibly expensive French face cream, fiercely massaging her jawline. She needed to smooth things over, particularly with the Lillingtons. John Lillington was the parish chairman, and Mary was the gatekeeper to every decent social invitation in the village. If Agatha wanted to avoid being entirely ostracized and, more importantly, if she wanted to find out what John had really been doing at Fiona's cottage, needed to play the penitent neighbour. An hour later, armoured in a deceptively soft cashmere twinset that screamed approachable affluence, Agatha marched up the Lillingtons' immaculate gravel driveway. She was clutching a box of Charbonnel Etwalker pink champagne truffles. It was a bribe disguised as an apology, and it had cost her a small fortune. She sounded the heavy brass knocker. When Mary opened the door, her expression was as welcoming as a patch of black ice. Agatha, Mary said tightly, her gaze dropping suspiciously to the luxurious gold box in Agatha's hands. Mary, darling, Agatha purred, summoning a smile of sheer manufactured warmth. I felt simply dreadful about our little misunderstanding yesterday. The heat, the shock of poor Fiona, my nerves were entirely frayed. I brought these as a peace offering. I do hope Yal forgive a silly, stressed woman her tactless remarks. Mary hesitated. Village manners ingrained over decades of passive-aggressive coffee mornings warred with her evident desire to slam the door in Agatha's face. The truffles won. Well, come in then, Mary sighed begrudgingly, stepping aside. We're just having coffee in the sitting room. The Lillingtons' sitting room was an oppressive shrine to floral chintz and aggressively polished brass. In the centre of a heavily upholstered armchair sat John Lillington. He looked dreadful. His usually ruddy face was a sallow grey, and he was clutching a teacup as though it were the only thing anchoring him to the earth. Agatha's brought chocolates, John, Mary announced in a voice that dared him to object. To apologise for yesterday. Very kind, John muttered, not meeting Agatha's eyes. Agatha took a seat on the edge of a sofa that felt like a brick wall covered in damask. Mary handed her a cup of coffee that tasted distinctly of instant granules, a culinary crime Agatha mentally logged as a personal insult. It's just such a tragic affair, Agatha began smoothly. balancing the awful coffee on her knee, and with poor Arthur Pendleton being dragged off in handcuffs. Well, one can't help but feel the police are grasping at straws. John twitched. Tea sloshed over the rim of his cup, staining his beige corduroy trousers. Wilkes knows what he's doing, he mumbled to his knees. Arthur had a temper. Oh, certainly, Agatha agreed, projecting a false air of breezy innocence. But strangulation, it takes such strength, such grit. And speaking of grit, John, I really must commend you on your dedication to village duty. Spending all those afternoons advising Fiona on her soil acidity. Mulch can be terribly heavy work, can't it? All those worms and damp rot. Mary's back stiffened as she poured herself more coffee. John has always been very hands-on with the parish council. Hands-on, Agatha repeated softly. Yes, I imagine you must have been elbow-deep in it, John. Pushing through the undergrowth, dealing with all those dreadful garden pests. Agatha was about to press further, intending to ask exactly what kind of fertilizer Fiona favoured, when she saw it. From beneath the heavy oak coffee table, a massive, hairy house spider emerged. It was the size of a small saucer, scuttling with horrifying, erratic speed directly toward John's polished brogues. What happened next was both entirely ridiculous and profoundly revealing. John Lillington let out a high-pitched, strangled shriek that would not have sounded out of place in a Victorian melodrama. He dropped his teacup entirely, which shattered against the brick hearth, and practically launched himself backward. He scrambled over the back of the chintz armchair, his face pale with absolute unfiltered terror, pointing a trembling finger at the floorboards. "Kill it!" he squealed, his voice cracking. "Mary, for God's sake, get the shoe. Kill the bloody thing." Mary sighed, looking entirely exasperated but thoroughly unsurprised. With practiced domestic efficiency, she rolled up a glossy copy of Country Life and swiftly dispatched the arachnid with a sharp thwack. "Honestly, John, it's just a spider." It was enormous, John panted, still clinging to the back of the armchair, his chest heaving under his tweed waistcoat. Agatha sat perfectly still, the terrible instant coffee forgotten. She looked at John, a grown man trembling like a frightened child over a common house spider, and felt a cold, brilliant rush of clarity. A man who suffered from such severe, paralyzing arachnophobia did not spend 4 afternoons elbow-deep in dank mulch and compost. He did not rummage through heritage rose borders where insects thrived. He hadn't been helping Fiona Henshaw in the garden at all, which meant he had been inside the house. And Mary, who clearly knew all about her husband's debilitating phobia, was deliberately lying to the entire village to cover for him. "Well," Agatha said brightly, setting her cup down on a coaster and rising to her feet with elegant composure. "I really must be going. So much to do in the garden today. Thank you for the coffee, Mary. Do enjoy the truffles." She let herself out, stepping into the crisp Cotswold air with a triumphant feline smile spreading across her brightly painted lips. She had been right all along. The Lillingtons were hiding a massive secret, and Agatha Raisin was just the woman to dig it up. Chapter 6, The Trespasser in the Tulips. Agatha Raisin was not a woman naturally suited to espionage. For one thing, she lacked the patience. For another, her wardrobe leaned heavily towards statement pieces rather than stealth apparel. After an hour of agonizing in front of her open closet, she finally settled on a beige Burberry trench coat, a pair of oversized Chanel sunglasses, and with a heavy sigh of resignation navy blue sensible flats that she usually reserved for driving. If John Lillington had been inside Fiona's cottage instead of pruning the roses, Agatha needed to know why. And more importantly, she needed to know if he had left anything incriminating behind before Inspector Wilkes miraculously stumbled upon it. Lavender Lodge, Fiona's deeply enviable wisteria-draped cottage, sat at the end of a winding lane lined with aggressively cheerful hollyhocks. The property was cordoned off with police tape, fluttering limply in the warm afternoon breeze. A lone, bored-looking police constable was stationed at the front gate, deeply engrossed in his mobile phone. Agatha didn't hesitate. She detoured down a narrow, muddy public footpath that ran behind the village properties, wincing as her expensive flats sank into the damp earth. She pushed her way through a gap in a hawthorn hedge, thoroughly snagging the sleeve of her trench coat, and stumbled into the pristine expanse of Fiona Henshaw's back garden. The garden was a masterpiece of horticultural smugness. Even without its owner, it bloomed with infuriating perfection. Agatha crept along the edge of a meticulously manicured lawn, keeping low behind a row of towering delphiniums, and made her way toward the rear of the cottage. She was just approaching the glass-paned French doors that led into Fiona's sitting room when she froze. She was not alone. A man was standing by the back door, half hidden by a sprawling clematis vine. He was fiddling intently with the lock, a thin metallic tool gleaming in his hand. Agatha's breath hitched. Arborglash. The murderer returning to the scene of the crime. She gripped the heavy leather strap of her handbag, preparing to swing it like a mace. Then the man turned his head, catching the sunlight, and Agatha's pulse executed a sudden, entirely unhelpful flutter. He was gorgeously, unapologetically handsome. Oh, he had a full head of thick salt and pepper hair, a sharply defined jawline, and the broad-shouldered build of a man who spent time on expensive sailboats. He was wearing a beautifully tailored charcoal blazer over a crisp, open-necked shirt. Agatha felt a powerful, immediate surge of feminine vanity. She violently regretted the sensible flats and wished she had applied her more striking ruby-red lipstick instead of a muted pink gloss. She pulled off her sunglasses, stood up straight, and summoned her most commanding executive voice. "Can I help you?" she barked, stepping out from behind the delphiniums. The man jumped, dropping his lock-picking tool with a tiny clatter. He spun around, his blue eyes widening in surprise before quickly narrowing into a cool, assessing stare. He took in her trench coat, her immaculate hair, and the fierce, slightly flustered expression on her face. "Well," he said, his voice a rich, dark baritone that sent a pleasant shiver down Agatha's spine. "You certainly aren't the police." "I am Agatha Raisin," she declared, lifting her chin. "I am a neighbour, and I am highly suspicious of men who attempt to break into the houses of murdered women in broad daylight. I should scream for the constable at the front gate." The man held up his hands in a gesture of surrender, offering a smile that was devastatingly charming and entirely insincere. "Please don't. I assure you my intentions are purely administrative. My name is Julian Vance." Agatha's eyes narrowed. The man with the flashy sports car. "Miss Simpson saw you arguing with Fiona outside the village shop." Julian sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "Ah!" "The village telegraph at work. Yes, I drive an Aston Martin, and yes, Fiona and I had a disagreement. But I didn't kill her, Mrs. Raisin." "Then what are you doing trying to pick her lock?" "Retrieving what is rightfully mine," Julian said, his charming veneer cracking slightly to reveal a hard, cold frustration beneath. "Fiona had something of mine. Documents. I need them back before the police start boxing up her life." Agatha stepped closer, her detective instincts completely overriding her sudden crush. "What sort of documents?" Julian looked at her, clearly weighing his options. He seemed to decide that Agatha was not a woman easily fobbed off with a polite lie. Fiona Henshaw, he said quietly, was not the wealthy, carefree divorcee she pretended to be. Her alimony dried up 2 months ago. She was flat broke, Mrs. Raisin. "Broke?" Agatha echoed, stunned. "But her clothes, the house, the imported mulch, all paid for by credit cards and, more recently, other people's money," Julian said grimly. "I am a financial advisor. Or rather, I was hers. I lent her a substantial sum of money to bridge a gap. When I came to collect, she laughed in my face and told me she'd found a much more lucrative source of local income." Agatha's mind raced, the pieces violently clicking together. A desperate broke woman. A terrified parish chairman who visited every afternoon but never touched the garden. "Blackmail," Agatha whispered, the word hanging in the warm afternoon air. "Precisely," Julian Vance said, his blue eyes locking onto hers. "Fiona wasn't just growing heritage roses, Mrs. Raisin. She was harvesting secrets. And someone in this picturesque little village finally decided they couldn't afford her anymore." Oh. Chapter 7. The humiliation at the Red Lion. Agatha Raisin, possessing the survival instincts of a seasoned London executive and the romantic desperation of a teenager, made a split-second decision. She grabbed Julian Vance by his impeccably tailored sleeve and dragged him back through the hawthorn hedge just as the bored police constable finally looked up from his phone and began to stroll toward the back garden. "If you want those documents," Agatha hissed, untangling her Burberry trench from a vicious bramble, "you're going to tell me absolutely everything over a drink. My treat." Julian brushed a speck of dust from his lapel, his blue eyes crinkling with amusement. "Mrs. Raisin, you are a force of nature. Lead the way." 10 minutes later, they were seated in a dark, secluded corner booth at the Red Lion. Agatha had hastily reapplied her lipstick in the pub's rather grim ladies' loo, fluffing her hair and wishing violently that she possessed the bone structure of a 20-year-old. She ordered a large gin and tonic. Julian ordered a Scotch neat. "So," Agatha purred, leaning across the sticky mahogany table and attempting to look both deeply mysterious and impossibly alluring. "Fiona was a blackmailer. I must admit, I always thought her smile was a little too bright, like a shark. Julian chuckled, a warm, resonant sound. He leaned in closer, his knee lightly brushing hers beneath the table. Agatha's heart executed an undignified little leap. She was entirely ruthless, Julian murmured, his gaze dropping briefly to Agatha's lips. She dug up dirt on half the people in her address book to fund her lifestyle, and now the police are bumbling about, looking for jealous gardeners. It takes a woman of your profound experience, Agatha, to see the bigger picture. Agatha froze. Profound experience. It was the sort of polite, devastating euphemism people used when they meant past your prime. Before she could process the sting, a new barmaid, a painfully pretty girl in her early 20s with glowing skin and a terrifyingly high ponytail arrived with their drinks. Julian's attention snapped away from Agatha instantly. His posture changed, the charming intensity he had directed at Agatha suddenly sharpened, focusing entirely on the young woman. "Thank you, darling," he said, his voice dropping an octave. He flashed a brilliant, predatory smile. "It's remarkably busy in here. Do you finish a shift soon?" The barmaid blushed furiously, giggling and twisting a strand of hair. "Around 6, actually." "Perhaps he'll still be around," Julian murmured smoothly. Agatha sat perfectly still, a cold, humiliating realization washing over her. The brushed knee, the intimate tournée wasn't attraction. It was manipulation. He saw her not as a woman, but as a gullible, middle-aged busybody who might be useful for distracting a constable or providing local gossip. He was playing her, just as easily as he was now charming the barmaid. A hot wave of shame flooded Agatha's cheeks, swiftly followed by a surge of pure, unadulterated fury. She had spent 20 years eating men like Julian Vance for breakfast in the PR industry. She would not be reduced to a pathetic, swooning village spinster. She stood up abruptly, the legs of her wooden chair screeching against the floorboards. Julian blinked, looking up at her in surprise. "I find I've lost my appetite for gin, Mr. Vance," Agatha snapped, her voice like cracked ice. She dropped a £10 note onto the table. "And my appetite for obvious, cheap flattery." "Oh. If you want your documents, I suggest you break in yourself. Try not to scuff your blazer." She didn't look back as she marched out of the pub, her chin held high. Though her eyes pricked with angry tears, she was Agatha Raisin. She didn't need a handsome grifter. She was going to crack this case wide open entirely on her own. Channeling her humiliated rage into immediate action, Agatha stalked down the high street. She needed a weak link. She needed John Lillington. She spotted the parish chairman's Volvo parked outside the village hall. Pushing open the heavy double doors, she found Lillington alone in the gloomy vestibule, nervously pinning a notice about the upcoming jumble sale to the corkboard. "No more games, John," Agatha barked, her voice echoing in the empty hall. Lillington dropped the drawing pins. He looked as though he might burst into tears. "Agatha, please. I told you. I was only helping her with the if you say the word mulch to me one more time, I will personally throw you into the duck pond," Agatha threatened, advancing on him. "You hate spiders. You don't garden. You were inside her house. And I know for a fact Fiona Henshaw was broke and blackmailing people. So tell me, John, what did she have on you?" Lillington crumpled. It was not a dignified sight. He sank onto a wooden bench, burying his face in his hands. It was the church roof fund, he sobbed, a pathetic, muffled sound. "And my pension. I lost it all, Agatha. Online poker. Cryptocurrency. I didn't know what I was doing. Mary cut off our internet at home to save money. I was using Fiona's Wi-Fi while Mary thought I was doing parish work." Agatha stared at him, her anger morphing into bewildered disgust. "You embezzled the roof fund? And Fiona found out?" "I left my laptop open on her kitchen table," he wailed. "She saw the bank demands. She told me she'd tell Mary, tell the whole village, if I didn't pay her £1,000 a month. I was terrified. But Agatha, I swear on my mother's grave I didn't kill her. I went there yesterday morning to beg for more time, but she wasn't there." Agatha looked at the pathetic, weeping man. He was a coward, a fool, and a terrible husband, but he lacked the cold, hard spine required for murder. "Pull yourself together, John," Agatha said briskly. "And for heaven's sake, tell Mary before the police find out." She turned and left the hall, her mind buzzing. If Lillington was telling the truth, Fiona had multiple victims in Carsley. The village was a powder keg of secrets, and Fiona had been holding all the matches. Agatha walked back to her cottage, her headache returning with a vengeance. She turned up her front path, fumbling in her handbag for her keys when she stopped dead, Sitting squarely on her welcome doormat was a single, flawless Rosamundi Fiona's prize-winning heritage rose. Pinned to the thorny stem was a small white index card. Printed on it in neat block letters were 3 words: "Mind your business." Agatha stared at the dead flower, the sting of her earlier humiliation vanishing entirely, replaced by a cold, thrilling spike of adrenaline. The murderer was watching her. The game was officially on. Chapter 8. The scorched secrets. Agatha Raisin stood in her hallway, staring at the withered Rosamundi and the neatly printed index card resting on her palm. A lesser woman might have locked the door, drawn the floral curtains, and dialed 999 with a trembling finger. Agatha, however, operated on a completely different emotional frequency. The threat did not make her feel vulnerable, it made her feel violently, incandescently angry. "Mind my business?" she muttered aloud to her empty hallway. "I'll show you my business, you melodramatic coward." She marched into the kitchen using a pair of stainless steel serving tongs to drop the rose and the note into a Tupperware container. Snapping the lid shut with satisfying finality, she poured herself a stiff measure of gin, entirely ignoring the tonic, and began to pace the length of her Persian rug. Someone in Carsely was deeply afraid of her. It was a remarkably intoxicating thought, a soothing balm to the stinging humiliation she had suffered at the hands of Julian Vance at the Red Lion. She wasn't just a middle-aged busybody, she was a legitimate threat to a murderer. A sharp, authoritative knock at the front door snapped her out of her triumphant reverie. Agatha paused to smooth her hair and check her lipstick in the hall mirror before throwing the door open, fully prepared to confront her anonymous tormentor. Instead, she found Sergeant Bill Wong standing on her doorstep. He looked utterly exhausted, his uniform slightly rumpled, carrying a brown paper bag that smelled faintly of stale chips. "Are you going to let me in, Agatha?" Bill asked wearily, rubbing his eyes. "Or are you planning to interrogate me on the doorstep?" "Come in, Bill," Agatha said, stepping aside. You look as though you've been dragged backward through a hedge." "I feel like it," Bill groaned, following her into the kitchen and collapsing onto a stool at the island. "Wilkes is in a foul temper. You'll be insufferably pleased to know you were right about Arthur Pendleton. We had to let him go an hour ago." Agatha leaned against the counter, unable to suppress a smug, triumphant smile. "I told him so." Swollen knuckles. It was blindingly obvious to anyone with eyes and half a brain. "It wasn't just the knuckles," Bill admitted reluctantly. "Arthur has a watertight alibi. Turns out his arthritis was flaring up so badly yesterday morning that his wife drove him to the Mercester Clinic for a steroid injection. He was sitting in a waiting room surrounded by nurses at the exact moment Fiona was strangled. Wilkes is absolutely livid. We are officially back to square one." "Not entirely," Agatha said smoothly. She reached across the counter and slid the Tupperware container toward him. "I received a delivery." Bill frowned, peering through the clear plastic at the dead rose and the white card. He read the block letters, and the colour instantly drained from his face. He looked up at Agatha, his dark eyes wide with genuine alarm. "Agatha!" "Where did you find this?" "On my doormat, 10 minutes ago," she replied breezily, taking a sip of her gin. "Someone obviously feels my investigative methods are getting a little too close to home. I consider it a compliment." "It is not a compliment, it is a death threat," Bill practically shouted, jumping to his feet. "This is exactly what I warned you about. You are treating a murder investigation like a competitive sport. Whoever killed Fiona is ruthless, and now they are targeting you. I have to bag this for evidence." "Ah, and you are going to pack a bag and stay at a hotel in Mercester until this is over." "I will do no such thing," Agatha bristled, her pride rearing its head. "I refuse to be chased out of my own home by a sociopathic gardener. Besides, this proves the killer is panicking, and panicking people make mistakes." "Tell me, Bill, what else did you find in Fiona's cottage?" Julian Vance mentioned documents. Blackmail material. Bill froze, looking caught out. He ran a hand through his short dark hair, sighing heavily. "I shouldn't tell you this. Wilkes would have my badge." He paused, looking at the Tupperware container. "We found a ledger in her potting shed. It was disguised as a gardening journal Soel pH levels, planting dates, but it was coded. Initials, dates, and corresponding amounts of money. Wilkes thought it was just plant orders, but it was a record of her extortions," Agatha finished, her eyes gleaming. "The killer must have been searching for it. That's why John Lillington was in the house, and that's what Julian Vance was trying to break in to steal." Before Bill could reply, a high, piercing wail sliced through the quiet village night. It was an archaic, terrifying sound, the emergency siren located on the roof of the Carsely fire station, typically reserved for severe floods or major farm fires. Bill's police radio suddenly crackled to life on his belt, spitting out a frantic burst of static followed by the panicked voice of the station dispatcher. All units. Suspected arson at Lavender Lodge. Repeat, major structural fire at the Henshaw residence. Agatha and Bill stared at each other in stunned silence for a fraction of a second. The shed, Agatha breathed, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. The police have the ledger, but the killer doesn't know that. They are burning the evidence. "Stay here, Agatha," Bill yelled, already sprinting down the hallway toward the front door. "Lock it and do not move." The door slammed behind him. Agatha stood in her kitchen for exactly 3 seconds. She looked at her sensible flats, looked at her designer trench coat, and then snatched her car keys from the bowl. Ignoring Bill's orders entirely, she bolted out into the smoky night, ready to catch a killer. Chapter 9. The silhouette in the smoke. Agatha's silver Renault swung around the corner of the lane with a screech of tires that would have horrified her local mechanic. Ahead, the night sky was no longer a peaceful velvet blue. It was stained a bruised, angry orange. Thick, oily plumes of smoke rose above the skeletal trees, and the smell of burning thatch sweet and cloying filled the cabin of her car. She pulled up onto the verge several hundred yards from Lavender Lodge. 2 fire engines were already there, their blue lights pulsing rhythmically against the stone walls of the neighboring cottages. Figures in heavy yellow tunics moved through the haze, dragging hoses that snaked across the gravel like giant, sluggish pythons. Agatha climbed out of the car, her eyes stinging. Through the swirling grey mist, she saw the garden Fiona's pride and joy being trampled underfoot. The potting shed, a sturdy timber structure where the police had found the ledger, was a roaring pyramid of flame. "Agatha! I told you to stay put." Bill Wong appeared beside her, his face smeared with soot. He looked less like a policeman and more like a chimney sweep in a crisis. "I couldn't just sit there, Bill. My nerves wouldn't stand it," Agatha shouted over the roar of the fire. "Is anyone inside?" "The house is mostly scorched, but the shed is a total loss," Bill yelled back, gesturing to the inferno. "Wilkes is over by the gate, having a meltdown. He thinks it's a local protest gone wrong. He's convinced the village is rising up against the new money element." Agatha looked toward the gate. Inspector Wilkes was indeed there, waving his arms and shouting at a weary-looking fire chief. But Agatha's gaze didn't stay on him. Her PR-trained eyes were habitually drawn to the peripherito, the things people weren't supposed to notice. Across the road, sheltered by the deep shadows of a massive weeping willow, a lone figure stood watching the flames. The person was perfectly still, seemingly mesmerized by the destruction. They weren't wearing a coat, despite the cooling night air. They were wearing a pale, sensible cardigan that shimmered faintly in the reflected orange glow of the fire. Agatha felt a cold trickle of sweat slide down her spine that had nothing to do with the heat of the blaze. "Mary," she whispered. She didn't tell Bill. She didn't call for Wilkes. Driven by a mixture of reckless bravado and a desperate need for the truth, Agatha slipped away from the police cordon, using the thick smoke as a veil. She circled back through a neighbor's orchard, her sensible flats squelching in the mud, until she came up behind the willow tree. Mary Lillington didn't turn around as Agatha approached. She remained fixed on the burning shed, her face illuminated by the fire. Gone was the mousy beige housewife who baked sponge cakes and worried about spiders. In her place was a woman of terrifying, icy composure. "It's a bit late for a garden bonfire, isn't it, Mary?" Agatha asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts. Mary didn't flinch. "It's a cleansing, Agatha. Some things are too filthy to be allowed to remain." That woman was a parasite. She was feeding on the weaknesses of decent people. Agatha stepped closer, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "John told me about the money, Mary. He told me about the roof fund and the Wi-Fi, but he didn't kill her. He couldn't kill a spider, let alone a woman." Mary finally turned. Her eyes were hard and bright, reflecting the dancing flames. "John is a weak, pathetic man. He spent 30 years leaning on me, and then he goes and hands our entire future to a creature like Fiona Henshaw. He didn't even have the sense to realize she was recording him. She had tapes, Agatha. Tapes of him crying, begging her for more time, admitting to the embezzlement. She was going to play them at the next parish meeting if we didn't give her the deeds to our cottage. "So you went to the flower show," Agatha said, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening thud. "You knew she'd be at the back of the tents, preparing her roses. You knew everyone else would be distracted by the speeches." She was laughing, Mary said, her voice devoid of any emotion. She was standing there in that ridiculous lavender dress, preening. I told her I had the deeds. She reached out to take the envelope and I saw the wire on the bench. It was so simple, like weeding a particularly stubborn nettle. Agatha took a step back. The sheer coldness of the confession was more frightening than the fire. And the note on my door? The rose? Mary smiled, a thin, jagged line. You were getting too close, Agatha. You always do. You're a very nosy woman. I thought a little warning might send you back to London where you belong. But then I realized I hadn't found the ledger. I thought Shed kept it in the shed. I had to be sure. The police already have the ledger, Mary, Agatha said softly. Bill took it yesterday. For the first time, Mary's composure shattered. A look of pure, animalistic panic crossed her face. She looked at the burning shed, the useless, empty sacrifice she had just made, and then at Agatha. Her hand dipped into the pocket of her cardigan, and Agatha caught the metallic glint of a pair of heavy-duty bypass pruners. You shouldn't have come here, Agatha, Mary hissed, stepping out from the shadow of the willow. You really should have minded your own business. Agatha backed away, her heel catching on a gnarled root. She looked around desperately. The firemen were too far away, the sirens were too loud, and Bill was nowhere to be seen. She was alone in the dark with a woman who viewed murder as just another form of household maintenance. Now, Mary, Agatha stammered, holding her handbag up like a shield. Let's not be hasty. Think of the scandal. Think of the cake competition next month. But Mary Lillington wasn't thinking about cake. She lunged, the sharp steel blades of the pruners snapping shut in the air just inches from Agatha's throat. Chapter 10, The Pruning of a Secret Agatha Raisin was many thinks a PR powerhouse, a social climber, and a woman who once spent £300 on a pair of shoes she couldn't walk in but. She was not a natural athlete. As Mary Lillington lunged again, the sharp snip-snap of the bypass pruners, echoing the frantic beating of Agatha's heart, she did the only thing a London professional could do in a crisis. She used her accessories as a tactical weapon. Get back, you madwoman, Agatha shrieked, swinging her heavy leather handbag with the precision of a medieval flail. The bag weighted down by a solid gold compact, 2 lipsticks, a spare set of keys and a heavy bottle of expensive perfume, caught Mary squarely on the shoulder. The force of the impact knocked the smaller woman sideways, sending the garden pruners clattering into the mud. Agatha didn't wait for a second round. She turned and bolted toward the light of the fire, her sensible flats slipping and sliding on the wet grass. Bill, Wilkes, murder! She bellowed at the top of her lungs, her voice easily cutting through the roar of the flames. She burst through the line of willow trees just as Mary scrambled back to her feet, her face a mask of mud-streaked fury. The police and firemen turned as one, their torches cutting through the smoke to find a dishevelled Agatha Raisin pointing a trembling finger back into the shadows. It's her, Agatha gasped, clutching her chest as her lungs burned with the acrid air. Mary Lillington, she killed Fiona. She's just confessed to the whole thing. Inspector Wilkes stepped forward, his face illuminated by a sudden flare from the burning shed. Now see here, Mrs. Raisin, if this is another one of your shut up, Wilkes, Bill Wong shouted, already sprinting past him toward the figure emerging from the trees. Mary Lillington didn't run. She stood at the edge of the light, her beige cardigan ruined, her expression shifting from murderous intent to a strange, vacant calm. She looked at the crowd of neighbours, the flickering blue lights, and finally, at the charred remains of the cottage. It was for the village, Mary said, her voice eerily clear. She was a weed. I was just tidying up. As Bill gently took her arm and led her toward a waiting squad car, the silence that fell over the gathered villagers was heavier than the smoke. John Lillington appeared from the crowd, his face a ghostly white, watching as his wife was placed in the back of the vehicle. He didn't say a word. He didn't even look at her. The aftermath was a blur of statements, cold tea in the back of an ambulance, and the relentless, grating sound of Inspector Wilkes trying to take credit for the meticulous psychological pressure he had supposedly applied to the suspect. 2 hours later, Agatha sat in the passenger seat of Bill's car as he drove her back to her cottage. The adrenaline had faded, leaving her feeling old, cold, and profoundly tired. You did well, Agatha, Bill said softly, his eyes on the dark road. But you could have been killed. Mary had a breakdown. She'd been carrying that secret for weeks, watching John crumble. It snapped her. She was a blackmailer, Bill, Agatha said, looking out the window at the moonlit Cotswold Hills. Fiona, she wasn't just a victim. She was a predator. Maybe, Bill sighed. But in this village, the predators usually wear better clothes than the prey. Doesn't make the murder any less real. They pulled up outside Agatha's cottage. She climbed out, her legs feeling like lead. "Agatha?" Bill called out as she reached her gate. "The orchid. The one from the show." Agatha paused. "What about it?" "Wilkes let me take it from the evidence locker, since it wasn't relevant to the crime." He reached into the back seat and handed her the heavy terracotta pot. The magenta blooms were slightly wilted from the heat of the marquee, but they were still magnificent. "Thank you, Bill," Agatha whispered. "Ah." She walked up her path, the weight of the orchid in her arms. She entered her quiet, dark house and set the plant on the kitchen island. She didn't turn on the lights. She simply sat there in the moonlight, staring at the perfect, expensive, fraudulent flowers. She had won, in a way. She had solved the mystery. She had beaten the police, and she had exposed the truth. But as she looked at the empty chair across from her, the familiar, hollow ache of loneliness returned, sharper than any garden pruner's. She reached out and touched a soft magenta petal. Tomorrow, the village would be a hive of gossip. Tomorrow, she would be the hero of the hour, at least until she said something tactless and offended the vicar. Tomorrow, she would go back to being Agatha Raisin, proud, difficult, and entirely alone. But for tonight, she simply sat in the silence, a glass of gin in one hand and her hard-won fake orchid in the other, listening to the quiet heart of the Cotswolds beating on, indifferent to the murders and the scandals of the people who called it home. Agatha sighed, took a long sip of her drink, and began to plan her outfit for the funeral. After all, appearance Essevan in the face of death mattered more than anything else. Chapter 11. The funeral and the frock. The funeral of Fiona Henshaw was, by all local accounts, the social event of the season, a fact that would have undoubtedly pleased the deceased had she not been the guest of honour in a polished mahogany box. The morning was crisp, the kind of sparkling Cotswold day that mocked the sombre black attire of the mourners snaking towards St. Mary's Church. Agatha stood before her mirror, adjusting a vintage pillbox hat with a veil that struck the perfect balance between deeply bereaved and intimidatingly chic. Oh! She had spent 3 hours choosing her outfit, a charcoal wool suit with silk lapels that nipped in her waist and made her feel like a widow from a French noir film. "If you can't be loved, Agatha," she muttered to her reflection, applying a layer of waterproof mascara, "at least be the best-dressed woman in the graveyard." The church was packed. Death, Agatha noted with her usual cynicism, was a marvellous way to bolster one's popularity. People who had spent months whispering about Fiona's garish taste in garden furniture were now dabbing their eyes with lace handkerchiefs. Agatha slid into a pew near the back, her eyes scanning the congregation. The atmosphere was thick with a brand of tension that only a village murder can produce. It wasn't just grief, it was the communal shame of having been duped. The news of John Lillington's embezzlement and Fiona's blackmailing side hustle had rippled through Carsely like a flash flood. John was conspicuously absent, reportedly resting in a private clinic in Malvern, though the village shop suggested he was actually hiding under his bed. Mrs. Bloxby sat in the front row, her shoulders slumped. She looked aged by the revelation that one of her flock was a cold-blooded strangler. Agatha felt a rare pang of genuine sympathy for the vicar's wife. To believe in the inherent goodness of people in a place like Carsely required a level of faith Agatha simply didn't possess. The service was a blur of platitudes. The vicar spoke of the fragility of life and the beauty of the flowers that fade, a metaphor that Agatha found particularly tasteless given that the flowers in question had been the catalyst for a homicide. As the congregation filed out into the churchyard for the interment, Agatha found herself standing next to Julian Vance. He looked devastatingly handsome in a black overcoat, though his eyes were restlessly scanning the crowd rather than the casket. "Looking for a new client, Julian?" Agatha asked, her voice dripping with enough honeyed poison to fell a horse. "Or perhaps just another middle-aged woman to charm for her secrets?" Julian turned, offering a dry, mirthless smile. "Ah, Agatha, still as sharp as a thorn. I hear you're the heroine of the hour. The woman who wrestled a murderer in the mud." "I did not wrestle, I defended myself with dignity," Agatha snapped. "And I noticed you weren't there to offer your administrative assistance when the pruners came out." "I prefer to avoid scenes," Julian murmured, adjusting his silk tie. "And speaking of scenes, I'll be leaving Carsely tomorrow. There's a certain lack of liquid assets in this village lately. Don't let the village gate hit you on the way out," Agatha said, turning her back on him with a flourish of her veil. She watched as the casket was lowered. The soil of Carsely was being returned to Fiona Henshaw, a final grim bit of mulch. As the mourners began to disperse, drifting toward the wake at the village hall where there would be plenty of dry sherry and awkward silences, Sergeant Bill Wong fell into step beside Agatha. "You look like you're plotting something, Agatha," Bill said, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "I'm plotting a vacation, Bill. Somewhere with no gardens, no vicars, and absolutely no green gardening wire." "You deserve it," Bill said, his expression softening. "The final report came in this morning. They found the recording equipment hidden in the base of a hollowed-out garden gnome at Fiona's cottage. She had enough dirt on this village to bury it twice over. Mary Lillington wasn't the only one she was squeezing, but Mary was the only one who broke." Agatha stopped by the church gate, looking back at the ancient stone tower. "The problem with villages, Bill, is that everyone wants to look like a heritage rose, but most of them have roots sitting in rot. Mary just decided to do the weeding." "That's a bit dark, even for you," Bill remarked. "It's the truth," Agatha said, her chin lifting. "Now, are you coming to the wake? I hear the WI has made those lemon drizzles you like, and I desperately need to tell Miss Simpson that her hat looks like a dead pheasant." Bill laughed, a warm, genuine sound that chased away some of the morning's gloom. "Lead the way, Agatha, but try not to solve any more murders before tea. My paperwork can't handle it." Agatha walked down the path, her heels clicking rhythmically on the stone. She felt a familiar surge of energy. The mystery was over, her reputation was restored, and she had a new, slightly tragic aura of danger that was sure to make her the center of attention at the village hall. She might be lonely, she might be aging, and she might be a bit too fond of gin, but as she adjusted her veil one last time, Agatha Raisin knew one thing for certain. She was the most interesting thing to happen to the Cotswolds in a century, and she wasn't finished with them yet. Chapter 12. The Last Laugh and the Lemon Drizzle. The wake at the village hall was a masterpiece of English social awkwardness. The air was thick with the scent of damp wool and the kind of aggressive politeness that usually precedes a lawsuit. Agatha moved through the room like a small, charcoal-suited shark in a tank of nervous goldfish. She felt a distinct, prickly satisfaction. Every conversation died the moment she approached, only to ignite into a frantic, hushed bonfire of whispers the second she passed. She was no longer just the pushy London woman who had tried to buy her way into village life with a cheated orchid. She was the woman who had stared down a killer in the smoke. Agatha accepted a plate of lemon drizzle cake from a trembling volunteer. She took a bite, noted it was slightly drier culinary failure she would certainly mention to Mrs. Bloxby later, and found herself cornered by Miss Simpson. "Agatha, dear," Miss Simpson hissed, her eyes darting around the room like frantic beetles. We're all simply stunned. To think of Mary Lillington, who always brought the best scones to the fete, being a strangler. Agatha finished bluntly, licking a crumb of lemon zest from her lip. "It just goes to show, Miss Simpson, one should never trust a woman who wears that much beige. It's a sign of a suppressed personality." Miss Simpson gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "And poor John, they say he's lost everything. The house is going on the market next week." Agatha felt a brief, sharp pang of something resembling guilt, but she suppressed it with a practiced shrug. John Lillington was a fool who gambled with the church roof. He's lucky he's in a clinic and not in the cell next to his wife. She moved away, her heels clicking authoritatively on the scuffed parquet floor. She spotted Mrs. Bloxby sitting in a corner, looking remarkably frail. Agatha sat down beside her, the silk of her suit rustling. "It will pass, Margaret," Agatha said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. The vicar's wife looked up, her eyes clouded with a deep, weary sadness. "I know, Agatha, but the trust, it's like a piece of fine china. Once it's smashed, you can glue it back together, but you'll always see the cracks. We all looked at Mary and saw a neighbour. We never saw the woman underneath. People only show you what they want you to see," Agatha remarked, thinking of her own carefully constructed image. "In London we call it branding. Here you call it keeping up appearances. It's the same thing, really, just more mud involved." Mrs. Bloxby reached out and patted Agatha's hand. "You have a good heart, Agatha Raisin, even if you do your best to hide it under all that expensive tailoring." Agatha stiffened, her pride instantly bristling. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean. I simply value a good fit." She stood up, needing to escape the uncomfortable warmth of Mrs. Bloxby's sincerity. She made her way to the exit, stopping only to give Julian Vance a final dismissive nod as he lingered by the door, looking like a man who had realized too late that the well had run dry. Outside, the late afternoon sun was casting long, golden shadows across the village green. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke from the distant ruins of Lavender Lodge. Agatha walked back to her cottage, her pace slowing as she reached her front gate. She looked at her garden today, predictable and utterly devoid of the chaotic, murderous passion that had consumed Fiona's borders. She entered her kitchen and found the magenta orchid still sitting on the island. It was definitely fading now. A few of the lower blooms had turned a bruised purple and dropped onto the granite. Agatha picked up a fallen petal. Ah! She thought of Fiona Henshaw, who had died for a rosette, and Mary Lillington, who had killed for a reputation. She thought of the secrets hidden in garden gnomes and the long, lonely nights of a Cotswold winter. Well, she sighed, tossing the petal into the bin. At least I still have my hair. She went to the cupboard, poured herself a glass of good stuff, not the supermarket brand she kept for guests, and walked out onto her patio. She sat in a wrought-iron chair, looking out over the valley. The village of Carsely was settling back into its old rhythms. The scandal would be chewed over for months, then years, becoming part of the local folklore, right alongside the Great Frost of '63 and the time the postman's trousers were stolen by a goat. Relationships would remain strained, curtains would twitch a little more frequently, and the next flower show would likely be a very sombre affair indeed. But as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of violet and bruised gold, Agatha Raisin felt a strange sense of peace. She was flawed, she was impulsive, and she was often her own worst enemy, but she was alive. She raised her glass to the empty garden. To the winners, she whispered, her voice caught by the evening breeze, and to the losers. But mostly to me. She took a long, cool sip of her drink, adjusted her pillbox hat, and began to wonder if the new bachelor who had just moved into the old mill liked orchids. Village life, after all, had to go on, and Agatha Raisin had no intention of being left behind in the weeds.